On February 26, 1991, at 3:47 in the afternoon local time, Captain H.R. McMaster stood in the turret of his M1A1 Abrams tank, somewhere in the Iraqi desert, staring at a small green screen that shouldn't have existed. The device in his hand, no larger than a brick, displayed 8 digits of coordinates that placed his position within 20 meters of his actual location on Earth. For the previous 6 hours, his Eagle troop had been racing northeast through a sandstorm so thick that visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. Yet every tank in his formation knew exactly where it was, exactly where every other tank was, and exactly where they were going. Within the next 23 minutes, his unit would engage a vastly superior Iraqi Republican Guard force in what would become known as the Battle of 73 Easting, and the technology in his hand would make it the most lopsided armored engagement in modern warfare. 300 miles to the southeast, Soviet military attaches at their embassy in Baghdad were receiving reports that made no tactical sense. American armored columns were moving at night through one of the worst sandstorms in recent memory, maintaining perfect formation spacing and arriving at predetermined coordinates with precision that exceeded anything in Soviet doctrine. Iraqi commanders reported that American artillery was landing within meters of intended targets without adjustment fire, that American aircraft were striking bridges and command centers in weather that should have grounded all aviation, and that American ground forces were navigating featureless desert terrain as if reading a city map. The initial assessment from Soviet observers was that Iraqi reports were exaggerated by panic and poor training. But then the numbers started arriving. American forces had advanced more than 200 kilometers in less than 48 hours through terrain where navigation had always been the primary limiting factor to offensive operations. The mechanized warfare that Soviet doctrine had spent 5 decades perfecting, the careful advancement with constant position verification and continuous land-based navigation, had just become obsolete. The technology that made this possible had been orbiting overhead for more than a decade, but the Soviet General Staff had fundamentally misunderstood what they were seeing. They knew the Americans were building a satellite navigation system. They had tracked every launch, analyzed the orbital mechanics, and even begun constructing their own constellation called GLONASS. What they hadn't grasped was the difference between a navigation aid and a revolution in warfare itself. Soviet military theory treated navigation as a support function, something that happened before combat. The Americans had built something different. They had built a system that turned three-dimensional space into a weapon, that made darkness and weather tactically irrelevant, and that gave every private with a handheld receiver the navigational capability that had previously required a trained survey team with hours of preparation. The implications were so profound that even after watching it unfold in the Gulf, Soviet military analysts would spend months trying to understand what they had actually witnessed. The story of how this happened begins not with satellites or war, but with a fundamental problem that had plagued military operations since armies first began maneuvering beyond sight of landmarks. Knowing where you are sounds simple until you're responsible for coordinating thousands of vehicles across hundreds of miles of terrain that looks identical in every direction. Before GPS, land navigation in desert or ocean required either visible landmarks, celestial observation, or radio signals from known ground locations. Each method had crippling limitations. Landmarks disappeared in sandstorms or darkness. Celestial navigation required clear skies, trained observers, and time to take readings. Ground-based radio navigation like LRN required extensive infrastructure, provided accuracy measured in miles rather than meters, and could be jammed or destroyed. During the Second World War, bomber crews navigating to targets over Germany faced errors of 8 to 10 miles even with the best available technology. Fighter pilots making landfall after missions over the Pacific sometimes had no idea which island they were approaching until they were close enough to see it. Naval convoys in the Atlantic relied on dead reckoning that could accumulate errors of dozens of miles over long voyages. The Soviets, facing similar problems, developed an obsessive focus on survey teams, detailed map preparation, and careful reconnaissance before any major operation. Soviet doctrine for desert warfare, developed primarily from experience in Central Asia and Afghanistan, emphasized slow methodical advances with continuous position verification against known landmarks. The idea that you could maintain tactical awareness while moving at 40 miles per hour through a sandstorm would have seemed like science fiction to Soviet planners as late as 1990. The American military had been struggling with the same problem, but approached it from a different angle. In the early 1960s, the U.S. Navy deployed Transit, the first satellite navigation system, primarily for ballistic missile submarines that needed precise position fixes for their targeting calculations. Transit worked by measuring Doppler shift from satellites in polar orbit, but it had severe limitations. A submarine might wait hours between satellite passes to get a position fix. The system provided no continuous coverage and gave positions accurate only to several hundred meters. It was useful for slow-moving submarines that could afford to wait, but worthless for aircraft, ground vehicles, or any platform that needed real-time navigation. The breakthrough came from two parallel development programs that the military initially saw as competitors. At the Naval Research Laboratory, a program called Tomation focused on placing extremely precise atomic clocks in orbit. The concept was elegant in its physics. If you could know the exact time a signal left a satellite, and measure precisely when that signal arrived at your location, you could calculate your distance from that satellite by multiplying the time difference by the speed of light. If you could do that simultaneously with signals from multiple satellites, you could determine your position in three-dimensional space through a mathematical process called trilateration. The challenge was the clock. To get position accuracy of a few meters, you needed timing accuracy measured in billionths of a second. The atomic clocks required were so precise that they would gain or lose less than 1 second every 300,000 years. The Air Force was pursuing a different approach called 621B, later renamed NAVSTAR, which focused on the orbital mechanics and signal structure needed for continuous global coverage. The key insight was that you needed satellites in medium Earth orbit, about 12,500 miles up, high enough that each satellite could see a large portion of Earth's surface, but low enough that the signals remained strong and the orbital mechanics stayed manageable. With satellites at that altitude, arranged in 6 orbital planes inclined at 55 degrees to the equator, you could guarantee that at least 4 satellites would be visible from any point on Earth at any time. 4 satellites were the magic number. 3 satellites could give you a position in 3-dimensional space, but you needed a 4th to correct for timing errors in the receiver's clock, which wasn't nearly as precise as the atomic clocks in the satellites themselves. In 1973, the Department of Defense merged these programs into a single system that would become the Global Positioning System. The military designation was NAVSTAR GPS, though everyone would eventually just call it GPS. The technical specifications were staggering for the era. Each satellite would carry multiple cesium and rubidium atomic clocks accurate to within nanoseconds. The satellites would broadcast on 2 L-band frequencies, designated L1 at 507542 MHz, and L2 at 127. The use of 2 frequencies was crucial because it allowed receivers to correct for ionospheric delay, the slight slowing of radio waves as they pass through the charged particles of Earth's upper atmosphere. The signal structure used a technique called code division multiple access, where each satellite broadcast a unique pseudo-random code that allowed receivers to distinguish between satellites and measure the precise timing of each signal. The first Block I test satellite launched from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California on February 22, 1978. By 1985, 10 satellites were operational, enough to begin testing the system's military applications. The early demonstrations were impressive enough that the military began limited procurement of receivers, but there was significant resistance. GPS receivers in the mid-1980s were expensive, heavy, and still viewed by many commanders as an interesting novelty rather than a fundamental capability. The Army purchased several hundred units designated Small Lightweight GPS Receiver, or SLGR, pronounced Slugger, which weighed 4 pounds and could store up to 9 waypoints. The military also developed a larger manpack unit weighing 17 pounds that provided more features but required a soldier to carry it as a dedicated load. What neither the Soviets nor most American commanders fully understood yet was that GPS was about to make possible an entirely new style of warfare. The key was not just knowing where you were, but knowing where everyone else was simultaneously, and being able to share that information across an entire force in real time. This concept, which would later be called network-centric warfare, transformed navigation from an individual skill into a shared operational capability. When every tank, every artillery piece, and every helicopter in a formation knows its position to within 20 meters and can communicate that position instantly, the entire unit becomes a single organism. Formations can maintain spacing in darkness and weather. Artillery can fire without pre-registered targets. Aircraft can rendezvous without visual contact. Logistics convoys can navigate cross-country without roads. The implications were so profound that they wouldn't become fully apparent until someone actually tried it in combat. The Soviets were watching the GPS constellation grow throughout the 1980s, but their analysis was shaped by assumptions that made sense within Soviet military doctrine. Soviet observers correctly identified that GPS was a navigation system. They correctly calculated its expected accuracy. They even began developing their own equivalent, GLONASS, which used a similar constellation design but with different signal characteristics. The design bureaus at Krasnodar 26 produced plans for a system that was technically comparable to GPS, using the same basic principles of satellite trilateration and atomic clock timing. Soviet engineers were not inferior to their American counterparts. Many were brilliant theoretical physicists and mathematicians. What they lacked was not intellect but a different military culture that would imagine how to use such a system. Soviet military doctrine emphasized centralized planning and careful preparation. Operations were choreographed in detail at higher headquarters, then executed according to strict timelines. Regimental commanders received orders that specified not just objectives but often the exact routes to take, and the timing of each phase. This approach had worked well in the Second World War, and remained embedded in Soviet thinking. Navigation was something you did during planning, not during execution. Units moved along pre-planned routes, with survey teams establishing control points and artillery positions carefully registered before offensive operations began. The idea that junior officers might need real-time navigation during the chaos of combat contradicted the entire structure of Soviet command and control. The Americans were developing a different approach, though they didn't fully realize it yet themselves. American military culture emphasized decentralized execution and initiative at lower levels. Company commanders were expected to adapt to changing situations. Platoon leaders made tactical decisions based on what they observed. This cultural difference meant that American officers immediately understood the value of giving every unit commander a device that showed his precise location at all times. It fit naturally into how they already thought about command. For Soviet officers, such a device seemed less critical because navigation decisions were made at higher levels anyway. This cultural gap meant the Soviets watched GPS deployment and saw a moderately useful navigation aid, while the Americans were building the foundation for a revolution in military operations. By August of 1990, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, the GPS constellation was still incomplete. 16 satellites were operational out of the planned 24, which meant coverage was not continuous worldwide. In the Gulf region, the constellation provided full three-dimensional coverage for about 19 hours per day. The master control station at what was then Falcon Air Force Base in Colorado Springs, now Shreveport Space Force Base, managed the constellation by tracking satellite orbits and uploading corrections to account for gravitational anomalies, solar pressure, and other factors that affected orbital mechanics. The system was working, but it hadn't yet been tested in a major conflict. The American military buildup in Saudi Arabia during Desert Shield exposed a problem that would become one of the most controversial aspects of the Gulf War. Despite more than a decade of GPS development, the military owned only about 500 demonstration receivers when deployment orders came. These were expensive units costing thousands of dollars each and produced in small quantities. When planners began calculating how many receivers would be needed for the deployment, the numbers were staggering. The Army's 7 Corps alone had more than 40,000 vehicles. Even giving GPS to just the lead vehicle in each formation would require thousands of units. The Marines needed receivers for their amphibious operations. The Air Force wanted them for combat search and rescue. The Navy needed them for their ships and helicopters. The total requirement was somewhere between 10 and 15,000 receivers, and the military had 500. The Pentagon initiated crash procurement of military-grade SLGR units, contracting for thousands of additional devices, but the manufacturers couldn't produce them fast enough. Someone made a decision that reflected both the urgency of the situation and a fundamental shift in how GPS would be used. They decided to buy commercial GPS receivers, the kind that civilians used for hiking and boating. In 1989, a company called Magellan had introduced the NAV-1000M, the first truly handheld commercial GPS receiver. It cost about $3,000 and was designed for recreational navigation. It wasn't built to military specifications, wasn't ruggedized for combat conditions, and wasn't designed to handle the classified military GPS signals. But it worked. It was available, and it was accurate enough. The procurement became something of a free-for-all. The military purchased approximately 1,000 Magellan NAV-1000M units through official channels. Other units were acquired through unofficial means. Soldiers' families were encouraged to purchase commercial GPS receivers and mail them to their deployed relatives. Some units pooled money to buy devices through retail stores. By the time Desert Storm began in January of 1991, American forces in the Gulf had a motley collection of approximately 4,000 military SLGR units, 1,000 commercial Magellan receivers, and an unknown number of other commercial devices, purchased private. It was the kind of improvisation that Soviet logistics officers would have found incomprehensible. The commercial units could only receive the civilian CA code, which was deliberately degraded by a feature called selective availability that introduced random errors to reduce accuracy to about 100 meters. The military units could receive both the CA code and the encrypted P code that provided accuracy within 20 meters. In practice, even 100-meter accuracy was revolutionary compared to previous navigation methods, and for most purposes it was sufficient. A tank commander who knew his position within 100 meters in the middle of a featureless desert was vastly better off than a tank commander using only dead reckoning and occasional landmark identification, which typically accumulated errors of several kilometers over a day's movement. What happened next caught almost everyone by surprise, including many American commanders who still thought of GPS as primarily a navigation tool for getting lost units back on track. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Starry, commanding the 2nd Squadron, 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, was among the first to grasp what was possible. His unit was assigned to lead 7 Corps' main attack into Iraq, screening for 3 heavy divisions that would follow behind. The mission required moving at high speed through empty desert, maintaining formation, and providing early warning of enemy forces. Starry realized that with GPS, his unit could navigate at night as easily as during the day, could move through sandstorms that would normally halt operations, and could coordinate the movement of dozens of vehicles without visual contact. Starry's squadron had enough GPS receivers, both military and commercial, to equip at least 1 vehicle in each platoon. His officers began training with the devices during Desert Shield, learning not just how to read coordinates, but how to plan routes, set waypoints, and use GPS to maintain formation spacing. They practiced night movements across the desert, something that would have been nearly impossible before GPS. The traditional method of desert navigation involved a led vehicle with a skilled navigator using a compass, constantly comparing the vehicle's heading to the desired course and making corrections. Every other vehicle followed the one in front, hoping the leader knew where he was going. With GPS, every vehicle could navigate independently while maintaining precise spacing from other vehicles. The Soviet military attaché in Riyadh was filing reports throughout Desert Shield about American preparations, but much of what he observed didn't register as significant. He noted that American units were receiving small electronic devices, and that these were apparently related to the satellite navigation system the Americans called GPS. His reports focused primarily on order of battle, equipment types, and logistics. The small handheld devices didn't seem tactically important. Soviet doctrine didn't have a framework for understanding how such devices might affect operations. The attaché's reports reflected this bias, mentioning GPS only in passing as part of a longer list of American equipment. When the air campaign began on January 17, 1991, GPS proved its value immediately in ways that sent Soviet observers scrambling to revise their assessments. American F-117 stealth fighters were striking targets in downtown Baghdad with precision that seemed impossible. The aircraft would fly in complete radio silence, navigate to their targets using GPS coordinates, and deliver laser-guided bombs with accuracy measured in meters. Traditional navigation methods would have required the aircraft to either follow a carefully plotted course using known landmarks, which would make them predictable, or use radar to identify terrain features which would reveal their position to defenses. GPS allowed them to fly unpredictable routes while maintaining precise timing and navigation. Strike packages involving dozens of aircraft from different bases were arriving at targets simultaneously, having navigated hundreds of miles in complete darkness without radio communication. Aerial refueling tankers were meeting fighter aircraft at predetermined coordinates over empty ocean, with precision that eliminated the need for time-consuming searches. The air campaign was demonstrating what network-centric warfare looked like when everyone shared a common, precise understanding of position and time. The Soviet attachés were filing reports describing these operations, but they were attributing American success primarily to stealth technology, electronic warfare, and airborne early warning systems. GPS was mentioned, but not emphasized as a primary factor. Then came the ground war, and everything the Soviets thought they understood about mechanized warfare collapsed in 96 hours. On February 24, 1991, coalition forces launched a ground offensive that military historians would later study as a turning point in military history. 7 Corps, the main attack force, consisted of the 1st Infantry Division, the 1st and 3rd Armoured Divisions, and the 1st Cavalry Division, supported by British forces, all told more than 1,200 tanks, and another 1,400 armoured vehicles. Their mission was to drive north into Iraq, then turn east, and destroy the Republican Guard divisions protecting the Iraqi retreat from Kuwait. The terrain they had to cross was called the Great Nafud, a stretch of desert that lacks any significant landmarks. In daylight with clear weather, navigation was difficult. In darkness or sandstorms, it became nearly impossible using traditional methods. Soviet doctrine would have required extensive reconnaissance, careful route planning, and slow methodical advances with frequent position checks. The Americans did something different. They programmed waypoints into their GPS receivers and drove at 40 miles per hour through the night and through sandstorms, maintaining perfect formation because every vehicle commander could see his position on a small green screen. Captain H.R. McMaster's Eagle Troop, leading the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment's advance, was navigating through one of the worst sandstorms in decades on February 26. Visibility was less than 50 feet. The traditional response would have been to halt operations until the weather cleared. Instead, McMaster's tanks were moving at nearly 40 miles per hour, maintaining formation spacing and heading toward coordinates where intelligence suggested they might find Republican Guard forces. At 15:47 local time, the lead tank reported enemy vehicles appearing out of the sandstorm at a range of less than 1,000 meters. What followed was a battle that demonstrated every advantage GPS provided. McMaster's 18 tanks, 9 Bradleys, and supporting units engaged elements of the Iraqi Tawakalna division, which had at least 40 tanks and numerous other vehicles. The Americans knew exactly where they were. They knew exactly where each friendly vehicle was positioned. Their thermal sights allowed them to see through the sandstorm. Their GPS allowed them to maneuver at high speed while maintaining tactical coherence. The Iraqis, equipped with Soviet-era equipment and trained in Soviet doctrine, were attempting to fight using traditional methods that assumed both sides were equally disoriented by weather. The Battle of 73 Easting, named for the map grid line where it occurred, lasted about 23 minutes. McMaster's unit destroyed more than 80 Iraqi armored vehicles and captured more than 100 prisoners. American casualties were 0. The engagement was so one-sided that military analysts initially suspected the reports were exaggerated. Soviet observers trying to understand what happened focused on the thermal sights that allowed the Americans to see through the sandstorm and on superior gunnery and training. But the thermal sights were not new technology. Soviet-era tanks had infrared sights that worked on similar principles. What was revolutionary was the ability to maneuver at high speed and zero visibility, while maintaining formation and tactical awareness. 2 days earlier, at the start of the ground war, the 2nd Brigade of the 1st Infantry Division had executed a night attack using GPS that demonstrated another dimension of what had changed. The brigade was assigned to breach the Iraqi defense line at a specific point, then continue north to secure key terrain. The breach operation required absolute precision because it had to be coordinated with artillery fire and air support, all timed to the minute. In previous wars, such an operation would have required extensive reconnaissance, marking the approach routes, and moving slowly enough to ensure units stayed on course. The 1st Infantry Division drove to their breach point at night, arriving within 5 minutes of the scheduled time without marking their route and without any pre-positioned navigation aid. The commander of the Soviet Union's Military Intelligence Directorate, the GRU, received a preliminary report on the ground war on February 27, while Iraqi forces were still collapsing. The report described American armor advancing 200 kilometers in less than 48 hours through desert terrain in weather conditions that should have limited movement to a few kilometers per day. Iraqi forces were reporting that American units appeared out of sandstorms at locations where no defensive positions existed, suggesting the Americans were ignoring roads and obvious approach routes. Multiple Iraqi commanders reported losing all situational awareness, while American forces seemed to maintain perfect coordination. The GRU report included a technical assessment section that focused heavily on the role of GPS. The analysis was remarkable for its combination of technical accuracy and strategic blindness. The report correctly described GPS as providing position accuracy of approximately 20 to 100 meters depending on receiver type. It correctly noted that GPS allowed American forces to navigate without landmarks or ground-based navigation aid. It correctly calculated that the GPS constellation over the Gulf region provided nearly continuous coverage. Then the report concluded that GPS was a valuable navigation tool that provided the Americans with a tactical advantage in desert warfare. The deeper implications that GPS had fundamentally changed the nature of military operations in any terrain and any weather were not yet apparent to Soviet analysts. Part of the Soviet misunderstanding stemmed from the fact that their own GLONASS constellation was still incomplete. By February of 1991, GLONASS had only 12 functional satellites in orbit, not enough for continuous global coverage. The Soviet military had experience with satellite navigation through earlier systems, but they had never operated with the kind of coverage that GPS was providing during the Gulf War. Soviet military exercises used GPS-equivalent capabilities only in planning phases, not during actual maneuvers. The Soviet command culture didn't naturally extend to trusting individual vehicle commanders with real-time navigation tools that allowed independent maneuvering. There was another factor that Soviet analysts struggled with. The American GPS deployment during Desert Storm was improvised, chaotic, and by Soviet standards deeply irregular. The mixture of military-grade and commercial receivers, the private purchases by soldiers' families, the rapid procurement of civilian equipment for military use, all of this violated Soviet assumptions about how military systems were supposed to be developed and deployed. Soviet military development followed rigid requirements, extensive testing, formal acceptance procedures, and careful integration into doctrine before fielding. The Americans had essentially thrown thousands of barely tested receivers at their units, and told them to figure out how to use them. By Soviet standards, it was almost absurd. By results, it had transformed the battlefield. The psychological impact on Soviet military observers went beyond the immediate tactical implications. For 5 decades, Soviet military planning had been built on the assumption that any major conflict would involve a degree of chaos and confusion that would slow operations and favor the defender. The Soviets had structured their doctrine around this assumption, emphasizing careful preparation, redundant systems, and centralized control to maintain coherence. The Americans had just demonstrated that with GPS, chaos could be eliminated from the navigation equation entirely. Weather, darkness, unfamiliar terrain, all the factors that historically slowed offensive operations and created opportunities for defenders to regroup, had just become tactically irrelevant. Colonel General Makhmut Gareev, a senior Soviet military theorist, wrote an analysis in March of 1991 that captured the depth of the problem. He noted that Soviet doctrine assumed both sides in a conflict would be equally affected by terrain and weather. Offensive operations were carefully timed to account for these factors, and defensive operations relied on them. If one side could operate at full speed regardless of conditions while the other could not, the entire mathematical basis of force ratios and operational planning collapsed. A defender might calculate that they had sufficient forces to hold a position if the attacker could only advance 10 kilometers per day. If the attacker could advance 50 kilometers per day instead, the defense became untenable. Gareev's analysis was classified and wouldn't be published publicly until after the Soviet Union dissolved. But it revealed that at least some Soviet military thinkers understood they had just witnessed something revolutionary. The American military's own understanding of what had happened was still developing. In the immediate aftermath of Desert Storm, the focus was on the obvious factors: air supremacy, precision weapons, night vision, and superior training. GPS was mentioned in after-action reports, but often as one item on a long list of advantages. It took several years of detailed analysis for military theorists to fully articulate how GPS had enabled the victory. The key insight was that GPS hadn't just made American forces better at what they were already doing. It had allowed them to do things that were previously impossible. Lieutenant Colonel Starry, whose 2nd Squadron had led the 7 Corps attack, wrote in his after-action report that GPS had made it possible to conduct operations that would have been inconceivable without it. He specifically noted that the speed of advance, the maintenance of formation coherence, and the ability to operate through the sandstorm at 73 Easting had all been enabled by GPS. Without it, his unit would have been forced to slow down, risk losing formation integrity, or halt operations until weather cleared. Any of those alternatives would have given Iraqi forces time to reposition or retreat. The speed and relentlessness of the American advance had been made possible by a 4-pound device that showed 8 digits on a green screen. The industrial and systemic advantages that made GPS possible were evident in every aspect of the system. The United States had launched 16 satellites and maintained them in operational status across a decade when the Soviet GLONASS program had struggled to get 12 satellites functional. The reliability difference reflected deeper issues in Soviet space program management, funding, and industrial capacity. American atomic clock technology was more reliable with fewer failures and longer service life. American launch vehicles had better track records. The ground control segment, managed from Shreve Air Force Base with supporting tracking stations around the world, functioned smoothly, while GLONASS control stations were almost entirely within Soviet territory, limiting their effectiveness for tracking and uplink operations. The receiver technology gap was even more stark. By 1991, the United States had multiple manufacturers producing GPS receivers at various price points and capability levels. Commercial units were available for $3,000 that worked reliably enough for military use. The Soviet military had no equivalent commercial GPS market, no pool of civilian technical talent developing innovative solutions, and no manufacturing base capable of producing receivers at scale. GLONASS receiver development was confined to a handful of design bureaus with limited resources and no competitive pressure to innovate. Even if GLONASS had achieved full constellation deployment in 1991, Soviet forces would not have had receivers to use it. The cultural dimension of the gap was perhaps most significant. American military culture encouraged junior officers and even enlisted personnel to experiment with new technologies and adapt tactics to leverage them. Tank commanders and platoon leaders were using GPS in ways that hadn't been anticipated by the system's designers, programming waypoints for tactical purposes, sharing coordinates over radio to coordinate maneuvers, using the devices to direct artillery fire. Soviet military culture discouraged such improvisation. Equipment was used according to doctrine and instructions. Innovation happened at higher levels and was then promulgated downward through formal channels. Defense Secretary Dick Cheney testified before Congress in March of 1991 that GPS had provided coalition forces with a decisive advantage in Desert Storm. He specifically noted that the system had allowed operations in weather and terrain conditions that would have grounded previous forces. His testimony marked one of the first high-level acknowledgements that GPS was not just a useful tool but a fundamental military capability. Congress responded by accelerating funding for both the space segment to complete the satellite constellation and the ground segment to produce more military-grade receivers. The Soviet response was complex and multifaceted. In public statements, Soviet officials emphasized that GLONASS would provide equivalent capabilities once fully deployed. Design bureaus at Krasnoyarsk received increased funding to accelerate satellite production. Soviet military journals published articles analyzing Desert Storm that acknowledged American technological advantages while emphasizing Russian capabilities to eventually match them. But the private assessments were more pessimistic. The Soviet Union in 1991 was in economic crisis, with government revenues collapsing and military budgets under severe pressure. Completing GLONASS would require billions of rubles at a time when the government could barely pay soldiers' salaries. More fundamentally, Soviet military theorists were grappling with the realization that even if GLONASS reached full deployment, it wouldn't be enough. The Americans had demonstrated not just a navigation system but an entire integrated approach to warfare that used precise positioning as a foundation for coordinated operations across all domains. Matching GPS technically wouldn't address the deeper issues of doctrine, command culture, receiver availability, and tactical innovation that had made American forces so effective in the Gulf. The Soviet military establishment had spent decades optimizing for one style of warfare and had just watched a demonstration that their entire approach might be obsolete. The broader geopolitical implications became apparent over the following months. Countries around the world had watched Desert Storm on television in near real time, thanks to CNN's coverage. What they had seen was the United States military operating at a level of effectiveness that seemed impossible. The speed, precision, and apparent invincibility of American forces had a deterrent effect that went beyond military calculations. Potential adversaries had to assume that any conflict with the United States would involve facing an enemy who could see in the dark, navigate through any weather, and coordinate operations across hundreds of miles with ease. The psychological impact was profound and lasting. For the American military, Desert Storm validated a decade of investment in space-based capabilities that had often been controversial. Throughout the 1980s, critics had questioned the cost of GPS, arguing that traditional navigation methods were adequate. The Air Force had fought budget battles to fund satellite production and launches. Now, with combat results demonstrating GPS's value, the system's funding was secure. The full 24 satellite constellation would be completed by 1995, ensuring continuous global coverage. Military GPS receiver procurement accelerated dramatically, with contracts for hundreds of thousands of units across all services. The commercial GPS industry exploded in the wake of Desert Storm. The images of soldiers using handheld GPS receivers in combat had been broadcast worldwide. Suddenly, civilian applications that had seemed niche became obviously valuable. Hikers wanted GPS. Boaters wanted GPS. Surveyors, pilots, truckers and emergency services all saw applications. Companies like Magellan, Garmin and Trimble expanded production and developed new models. The civilian GPS market grew from a few $1 million in revenue in 1990 to billions of dollars by the end of the decade. Soviet engineers and scientists watched this commercial expansion with frustration. GLONASS remained a military-controlled system with no commercial infrastructure. The Soviet Union lacked the entrepreneurial ecosystem that could have built a commercial GLONASS receiver industry. Even after the Soviet collapse, when Russia inherited the GLONASS program, commercial development remained stunted by limited funding, restricted access to technical specifications, and lack of manufacturing capacity. GPS would achieve such dominance in both military and civilian markets that GLONASS would struggle for decades to find users even after reaching full operational capability. The technical competition between GPS and GLONASS revealed deeper truths about the two systems that created them. GPS benefited from American advantages in computer technology, miniaturization, and commercial electronics manufacturing. GPS receivers became smaller, cheaper, and more capable because they were built using cutting-edge semiconductor technology and could leverage commercial investment in related fields like cellular communications. GLONASS receivers remained expensive specialty items because they were built in low volumes by defense contractors with limited access to advanced commercial components. The satellite design philosophies differed in ways that reflected broader systemic approaches. GPS satellites were designed for long service life, with careful attention to reliability and redundancy. Each satellite cost approximately $40 million, but was expected to function for a decade or more. The Block II satellites launched in the 1980s had an average operational life exceeding their design specifications. GLONASS satellites were cheaper to build but had shorter operational lives and higher failure rates. The Soviet approach of building more satellites more quickly worked in theory but foundered in practice due to launch vehicle limitations and quality control issues. Ground control was another area where systemic differences mattered. The GPS Master Control Station at Shriver Air Force Base operated with extraordinary precision, uploading navigation data to satellites multiple times per day to account for orbital perturbations and clock drift. The control station had access to tracking data from a global network of monitoring stations, allowing precise orbit determination. GLONASS control stations were almost entirely within Soviet territory, providing less optimal geometry for orbit tracking and requiring Soviet satellites to spend less time in view of control stations each orbit. This reduced the frequency and quality of navigation data upload. By December of 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Russia inherited the GLONASS program, along with most Soviet space infrastructure, but the funding situation became catastrophic. Throughout the 1990s, GLONASS satellites failed faster than they could be replaced. The constellation that had 12 functional satellites in February of 1991 shrank to just 6 by 1999. Without adequate funding for satellite production and launches, GLONASS became increasingly irrelevant as a navigation system. GPS, meanwhile, completed its 24-satellite constellation and began launching improved Block I IR satellites with enhanced capabilities. American military doctrine evolved rapidly to incorporate GPS as a central enabling technology. The concept of network-centric warfare that had been demonstrated in Desert Storm became the organizing principle for military transformation throughout the 1990s. Every major weapon system was designed or modified to include GPS receivers. The Army developed the DE-GIR, or Defense Advanced GPS Receiver, to replace the hodgepodge of receivers fielded during Desert Storm. The Air Force integrated GPS into the Joint Direct Attack Munition, or JDAM, which converted unguided bombs into precision weapons at a fraction of the cost of laser-guided munitions. The Navy used GPS to enable precise navigation for ships, submarines, and aircraft operating far from land. The transformation went beyond equipment to doctrine and training. Officers at all levels now planned operations assuming GPS availability. The ability to designate locations using precise coordinates and know that everyone in the force would navigate to those coordinates with meter-level accuracy became fundamental to how the military operated. Call for fire procedures changed. Helicopter operations changed. Logistics changed. The idea of operating without GPS became almost unthinkable, which created its own strategic vulnerability that would become apparent in later years. The philosophical implications of GPS extended beyond military operations to questions about the nature of warfare itself. The French military theorist Carl von Clausewitz had written in the 19th century about the fog of war, the uncertainty and confusion that made military operations inherently unpredictable. GPS hadn't eliminated the fog of war, but it had eliminated one major component of it. The question of where you were and where friendly forces were located was no longer a source of uncertainty. This reduced fog had profound effects on how operations unfolded. Commanders could make decisions faster because they had better situational awareness. Forces could operate at higher tempo because they weren't slowed by navigation uncertainty. Mistakes due to misidentification of friendly forces decreased because everyone knew where everyone else was. For individual soldiers, GPS changed the psychological experience of combat. The feeling of being lost, of not knowing where you are or how to get where you're going, is deeply primal and unsettling. In previous wars, that feeling was common. Units got lost. Patrols became disoriented. Individuals separated from their units had to navigate using minimal tools. GPS provided a constant reassurance, a small screen showing exactly where you were on Earth. This psychological effect was difficult to quantify but meaningful. Soldiers who knew they couldn't get lost were more confident, more willing to take initiative, and more effective at independent operations. Soviet veterans of Afghanistan, who learned about GPS capabilities during Desert Storm, understood immediately what they had missed. The Soviet war in Afghanistan had been plagued by navigation difficulties in mountainous terrain where landmarks were confusing and maps often inaccurate. Helicopter pilots had crashed trying to land at incorrect coordinates. Ground units had called in artillery on their own positions because of navigation errors. The ability to know your exact position at all times would have saved Soviet lives and made operations vastly more effective. Instead, Soviet forces had struggled with paper maps and compasses while GPS satellites passed overhead every few hours, usable in theory but inaccessible in practice due to lack of receivers and encrypted signals. The American decision in the year 2000 to turn off selective availability, the deliberate degradation of civilian GPS signals, marked another strategic milestone. President Bill Clinton announced that civilian GPS would now provide accuracy of 20 meters or better instead of the previous 100 meters. The decision reflected confidence that the military advantage provided by GPS came not just from accuracy but from integration, training, and doctrine. Giving the world access to 20-meter accuracy was a net benefit because it would accelerate civilian applications and make GPS the global standard. Russia could provide similar accuracy through GLONASS, but without the receiver base and commercial infrastructure, it wouldn't matter. The GPS story from Cold War development through Desert Storm and beyond illustrated a pattern that repeated across many technologies during the Cold War. The Soviets were not technically incompetent. They had brilliant scientists, capable engineers, and theoretical knowledge equal to the Americans in many fields. What they lacked was the systemic capability to translate technical achievement into operational advantage. GPS required not just satellites and atomic clocks, but also a commercial electronics industry, a culture of innovation at low levels, an entrepreneurial ecosystem, funding stability over decades, and a military doctrine that encouraged initiative. The Soviet system couldn't provide those elements, regardless of how well their scientists understood the physics of satellite navigation. The human dimension of this story was captured in a moment at the very end of the Cold War. In late 1991, shortly after the Soviet Union dissolved, a delegation of Russian military officers visited the United States as part of a new military-to-military exchange program. The delegation included Colonel Yuri Babin, who had served as a navigation specialist and had been involved in early GLONASS planning. During a visit to Shriver Air Force Base, Babin watched the GPS master control station operations and asked detailed questions about satellite tracking, orbit determination, and signal quality monitoring. At the end of the tour, he was quiet for a long moment, then said through an interpreter, "We understood what you were building. We didn't understand what you would do with it." That distinction captured the entire story. Understanding the technology was never the barrier. Understanding how to use it, how to integrate it into operations, how to get it into the hands of individual soldiers and trust them to figure out applications, how to build an entire way of warfare around the assumption of precise navigation, that was the barrier. The Americans hadn't necessarily planned it that way. Much of what happened during Desert Storm was improvised and unexpected, but the American system was flexible enough to allow that improvisation and effective enough to turn it into overwhelming advantage. Today, GPS is so ubiquitous that it's easy to forget how revolutionary it once was. Every smartphone has a GPS receiver, cars navigate using GPS. Delivery drivers rely on GPS to find addresses. The idea that knowing your position to within a few meters anywhere on Earth is a notable capability seems almost quaint. But in 1991, in the Iraqi desert during a sandstorm. It was the difference between moving at 40 miles per hour toward your objective and sitting stationary waiting for weather to clear. It was the difference between a perfectly coordinated armored assault and a confused, stumbling advance. It was the difference between winning decisively in 96 hours and grinding through a weeks-long campaign with vastly higher casualties. The technology that made that difference had been orbiting overhead for more than a decade, but its true significance only became clear when someone tried to fight a war with it. The Kremlin had been watching those satellites all along, understanding them technically but missing completely what they meant strategically, until Captain H. McMaster's tank column appeared out of a sandstorm at precisely the coordinates where GPS said they would be, and destroyed a Republican Guard unit that never had a chance. If you found this story compelling and want more deep dives into Cold War technology and the moments when American capabilities shocked the world, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.